Portanto, vamos também continuar esta prática. O Anthony Barcellos vai apresentar um trabalho feito pela Katharine Baker, que também já apresentou em alguns dos nossos congressos, sobre o seu interesse em conhecer as raízes açorianas. Então, Anthony tem a palavra.
Manuela, se eu pudesse...
Oh, I have to say it in English, right? Sorry.
No, that's fine, that's fine. I was going to say it in English, but before, antes, só rapidamente em português, era só para dizer, há aqui uma coincidência. Portanto, acho que o bisavô da professora Helena de Menezes batizou-se na mesma igreja que eu batizei, na Praia da Vitória. Portanto, eu tenho família Catano pelo lado materno e família Menezes pelo lado paterno, portanto deve haver família Lourenço, não Menezes, desculpe, Lourenço. E depois, somos primos, é verdade, e depois da parte do Anthony Barcellos, cujos avós também vieram da Praia da Vitória, portanto há aqui uma conspiração da praia neste momento.
Sim, somos parentes, com certeza. Que alegria!
Agora passa para inglês.
So I'm sorry, Anthony. So Anthony, I was just explaining what you are going to talk about. The research that Katharine Baker was so keen on doing about her Azorean roots. And because we are aware of time, we go directly to you, Anthony. Thank you for presenting in her name.
Muito obrigado. Esta história vai ser em inglês, a primeira língua da Kathy Baker e também a minha segunda e também a língua que eu conheço muito melhor. The words are Kathy Baker's, but I will be responsible for any mispronunciations, me along with my various speech impediments. Eu sou neto das avós da Ilha Terceira. So as Diniz said, somos todos primos. I will now bring up Kathy's PowerPoint. So I am now sharing the screen with Kathy's presentation, and I will go to her text and begin to read it. From soup to nuts, how a family recipe drove me crazy searching for my Azorean roots. Whenever young Katharine Baker asked about her father's ancestry, her family claimed his parents were born in Northern California of Flemish descent, adding that because her grandfather insisted he was an orphan, they knew nothing else of his origin. Then they'd promptly order her to drop the topic, threatening that if she pursued it further, she could cause trouble, a logic-defying reply, but out of self-preservation, she eventually quit asking. On a seemingly unrelated note, her father loved homemade watercress soup. So once or twice each spring, her mother would fix a small batch for just the two of them. One time in her teens, Katharine asked to try a little, but her mother refused, saying she wouldn't like it. Suspecting parental reverse psychology, Katharine persisted, but her mother lashed out that there was none to spare. So any that she gave her would just go to waste because she wouldn't like it and don't ask again. Katharine had no idea why this upset her mother, but buried the memory. Waiting for the second slide to come up.
Sopa de agrião, para aquelas pessoas que não têm familiaridade. Watercress soup é sopa de agrião. Estamos a ter alguns problemas com os slides. Okay.
Decades later, Katharine's husband found a widowed father's papers, death certificates for some older relatives, listing their parents' birthplaces as the Azores. Katharine only knew those were Portuguese islands somewhere in the Atlantic, but wondered if her family still retained vestiges of this heritage. What she never could have guessed was that the barely recalled soup from childhood pinpoint her paternal grandparents' birthplaces. In hindsight, she believes her mother's refusal to share watercress soup was but a small piece in a family conspiracy to eradicate her roots, perhaps in a misguided effort to shield her from anti-Portuguese prejudice they might have experienced. Katharine next phoned her much older only first cousin, Don, who conceded he'd always known the truth. In childhood, he'd lived with his divorced father for several years at his and Katharine's paternal grandparents' house in Oakland, where the elders all spoke Portuguese whenever they wanted to keep secrets or gossip from him. He said their grandfather specified having been born on Flores. Don recalled family trips to his father's small hometown of Benicia, including drives with his dad and grandpa to attend the annual Holy Ghost Festival. On weekends that featured a parade and free meals of sopas for the crowd on Sunday. Sopas, Katharine asked, giant vats of beef soup cooked over wood fires that Don got to join the menfolk in tending all night. Male bonding, no bedtime, fire, a boyhood trifecta. When she asked, Don admitted the reason he never told her of their father's Portuguese origins was to keep family peace, explaining that after returning from military service in his early 20s, his casual mention of the P word to an uncle, despite its not having been taboo before, provoked the unexpected rebuke never to raise the subject again. Don's main curiosity late in life was how the family got the glaringly un-Portuguese surname of Fredericks. When Katharine proposed taking their Aunt Beatrice to lunch in order to ask more about this hidden family history, Don turned hesitant. At the restaurant, she discovered why. Aunt B initially denied they were Portuguese. And even after Katharine pointed out that on death certificates, Grandpa had listed Grandma's birthplace as the Azores, and a decade later, B's eldest brother had given the islands as Grandpa's, B dismissed both men as misinformed. Then Katharine began divulging details Don had told her. B grudgingly confessed, adding that the concealment plot was hatched in a long ago family meeting at her house, included Katharine's parents, although she purportedly could not recollect the year or reason. She added that previously, the family had contemplated claiming to be Swedish. But once Katharine stopped laughing at the absurdity of her dark-haired suntanned clan trying to persuade anyone they were Scandinavian, Aunt B admitted they opted for Flemish instead. She closed by ordering Katharine never to mention their Portuguese heritage again, because nobody wants to hear about it. Once home in Pennsylvania, Katharine devoured books from the University of Pittsburgh Library about Azoreans and their emigration. A few years later, she discovered early Azore American websites, one of which had recipes typical of each island, including, under Flores, her mother's watercress soup. She figured that as a bride, her mother must have obtained directions from her husband's mother. Katharine eventually began studying Portuguese at Pitt, hoping to gain enough proficiency to research her roots. After 2 years, she booked a trip to the Azores. On Flores, she dropped by the tourism post in Santa Cruz, where she related the saga of her concealed half-Azoreanness to director José Silva. Since Katharine didn't know her grandfather's name, and Frederic is a given name, not a surname in Portuguese, José Silva couldn't guess his native parish. That is, until she began describing her family's soup. He instantly surmised that since wild watercress grows profusely on the island's remote west coast around Fajadin and Fajagrande, her grandfather likely hailed from around there. The next day, a tour guide showed Katharine around Flores, with emphasis on those villages, but they found no clues. Back home from the Azores, Katharine recalled that her father had had a first cousin in Fresno, long since deceased, whom she met once along with his own father, Joseph's younger brother, during a family dinner at B's house. And now she wondered if any of that branch of the family might still reside there. The phone directory listed the cousin's widow, whom Katharine called. When she mentioned that her grandpa said he was born on Flores, Maxine replied that she never knew her father-in-law's home island, but late in life he'd confided that his birth name was João Frederic Henriques, although in the US he'd anglicized it to John Henry Fredericks. Katharine reported this to her aunt, who revealed that her father's parents had settled in Folsom when he was young, but after failing to make a go of it, returned to the Azores 2 years later, leaving him behind with another family. Maxine's daughter, Carol, further probed her mother, as well as a niece in Sacramento, yielding the information that John Henry's wife's parents were buried in Folsom. As internet genealogy burgeoned, Katharine began researching online. In the 1880 US Census, she found 14-year-old schoolboy José Frederic, as well as 12-year-old Anton Frederic, unknown to her, both born in Portugal and boarders on the farm of Joseph Silvia and his siblings. Mr. Silvia, age 37, was a native of the Western Isles, then a common term for the Azores. All were listed as residing in Denverton, only 8 miles outside Benicia, where Grandma's parents had settled with her in 1877, and to whom another daughter was born 2 years later. On Katharine's second trip to the Azores, she scoured old Flores baptismal logbooks at the regional archives in Horta. She quickly discovered the parish register for Fajazin showing João Frederic Henriques' baptism on the correct date. And she unexpectedly began weeping, prompting a staffer to comfort her as she explained why. Retired history teacher, Dr. Fernando Ribeiro, conducting his own research there, offered to explain abbreviations, archaic terms, and boilerplate phraseology in the handwritten record to Katharine. But alas, there was no listing for José Henriques. The closest candidate in her grandfather's age was José Frederic, with the same father as João, but a different mother. Katharine's best guesses? José Frederic was her grandfather. His mother died when he was little, lending partial credence to his orphan claim. So John was a half-brother, and maybe José never knew his exact birth date. At the regional archives in Angra do Heroísmo, Katharine slogged through São Jorge's baptismal record seeking her grandmother, Maria Victoria Noronha, and Maria's Manuel. She began with Topo, from which she had evidence that Manuel hailed, because it seemed logical that if he was born there, his daughter might have been too. Katharine located Manuel in Topo, albeit a year older than he claimed in the US, born to a mother surnamed Noronha, and his father listed as unknown. Illegitimacy could explain why Noronhas she'd met on São Jorge during her first trip had never heard of Manuel. Then she found his mother's baptismal record 17 years earlier, but searching every São Jorge parish baptismal register in and around the years of their births for Manuel's wife Isabel, 1854, and daughter Maria, 1874, proved fruitless. During her Aunt B's final years, Katharine found that during phone conversations, she could pry bits about their Portuguese heritage from her by asking about family stories, except never using the P word, which always prompted B to clam up. One day, Katharine mentioned watercress soup, which B confessed she still occasionally made in tiny batches for herself. B recounted that when her widowed grandmother Isabel would stay with the family in Oakland in the 1930s, she'd help wash the cress while B's father thin-sliced potatoes into discs for a batch of soup big enough to feed all 8 of them. B enumerated the ingredients: small amounts of onion, garlic, and potatoes, and large volumes of water and watercress, plus plenty of stale bread torn into rough chunks to add when serving. Chicken or vegetable stock instead of water for more flavor? No. Beans to increase protein? No. Diced carrots for color and nutrition? No. Bits of cooked linguiça? Absolutely not. B brooked no violation of the sacred recipe. On Katharine's last visit, B fetched a packet of faded letters in Portuguese that she snidely announced she was planning to throw away on grounds they were of no interest to anyone, unless Katharine wanted them. Ignoring the insult, she accepted. They turned out to be mainly obsequious to Isabel for money from relatives in Ponta de Faja Grande on Flores between 1913 and 1936. One day, while trawling ancestry.com for traces of relatives, Katharine was stunned to find 22-year-old farmer José Frederic, an Azores native and California resident, listed on an 1887 ship's manifest as arriving in second class at Boston from the Azores. She hypothesized that her grandpa managed to save up enough to go see his family on Flores, where he would have met 13-year-old brother João. From cousin Carol's records, Katharine knew that João immigrated to America in 1892 at age 18, so inferred that José's visit could have paved the way for João's immigration to California. While clearing out B's house after her death, cousin Don came across a small box of old letters and mementos, including a yellowed religious card, Santino, with the drawing of a saint, bearing an imprinted message translating as authentic portrait of the image of Saint Joseph, who is venerated at the Church of Feijó Grande, island of Flores, on the front. And on the back, José Frederic Henriques, remembrance from his mother, Mariana Apolonia Gonçalves, January 1st, 1893. Mariana Apolonia had been listed on João's baptism registration as his mother, albeit as Mariana Pilania, although not on the one Katharine surmised was José's. Next time Katharine visited Horta's archives, she located both Maria and Isabel's baptisms in the records for Feijó Grande, but she was surprised to read on her grandmother's Maria, first daughter of the unmarried Isabel Tomasia, and an unknown father. Only DNA testing can reveal whether Manuel Noronha was Katharine's biological great-grandfather. Maybe he and Isabel couldn't wed due to his illegitimacy or lack of church paperwork, or Maria wasn't Manuel's child, or he and Isabel never wed, living as common law spouses. 12 years after her first visit to Flores, Katharine returned, this time spending part of her stay in Ponta de Faja Grande at an old stone building renovated into a tourist studio. Roaming this tiny settlement of ancient stone structures, some long since tumbled down, in a community that had by now dwindled to fewer than a dozen residents, she imagined the primitive conditions, poverty, and isolation in which her ancestors likely lived. They would have been almost totally cut off from the rest of the world, save for an occasional whaling ship picking up or dropping off supplemental crew. Perhaps how Jorgensa mariner Manuel met a local girl during a stop. Looking around, Katharine realized the meager garden crops in her family's soup recipe, as well as stale bread, were one way for poor people leading a subsistence lifestyle to stretch precious ingredients raised in their kitchen gardens, especially stored produce like potatoes and dried braids of onions and garlic, combined with abundant volumes of watercress and fresh water, free for the foraging from riffles below the waterfalls that plunged down the cliffs above Faja. What irony, she reflected, that this peasant dish would one day become a luxury elsewhere and lead to her buried family history. Thank you.
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada. Thank you, Anthony, for telling us the story of Katharine. It's similar in a way to Lena. Lena with a happy ending, and Katharine, you know, she still has some doubts, but it's the power of food, as we know when we talk about grandchildren, grandparents, you know, they know a comida da vovó, and this soup made its way all, you know, to her discovery of something that's so precious. Thank you so much. And Diniz, I hope I didn't go too much, you know, on the call. It's 10 minutes past the hour that we should have started the other session. I apologize. Thank you all for such an interesting information and lots of emotion in some of the presentations. We were moved, and I'm sure we learned a lot today. Obrigada às colegas todas pelas vossas apresentações, umas comoventes, outras muito informativas. Tenho a certeza que aproveitámos bem estas 2 horas e vamos deixar agora os jovens falar, porque falamos tanto de avós que sem netos nada disso nos interessaria. Queremos passar a nossa herança, o nosso património, a nossa identidade e todos os nossos saberes. Muito obrigada, Diniz.
Obrigado, Manuela. Obrigado, obviamente, a todos os colegas. Muito obrigado ao Anthony também, agora no fim em inglês. 2 palavras em português, não vão ser só jovens, este painel inclui várias gerações. E de facto no último dia, com a orientação da professora Rosa Simas, teremos então um painel só com jovens. Temos, portanto, várias gerações e eles estão a aparecer um a um, e portanto eu agradeço, e o Anthony também vai ficar. Portanto, eu vou passar, o painel é os avós, portanto, heranças, identidades e construções culturais. Vamos passar então para o inglês. Thank you all so much for joining us. This panel will be, of course, in English, and we have already some of the panelists coming on, and they're all on. They'll be showing here shortly. We had a total of 6 panelists. One had a medical emergency, is not going to be here with us, but the others are all here, and we thank them for their presence. So we have David Silveira Garcia, who is a fadista. We have Amanda Clemente, who is a student, a university student. We have Kathy Mendes-Gulley, who is a researcher and an author. We have Anthony Barcellos, who you just saw, you just heard more than saw, who is a renowned author. I should put that forth. He has one of my favorite novels of all time from not just the Portuguese Americans, just a good novel, which is Land of Milk and Money, which I highly recommend. And I think Esmeralda Cabral, who is coming to us from neighboring country of Canada, originally from the Azores, of course, and who is also an author who has an upcoming memoir that she'll talk about. And so welcome to each and every one of you. We're going to take a few minutes and we just briefly touched upon this in an email. So, if some of the questions surprise you, that's okay. We all like surprises. I'd like to start probably, if it's okay, with David. And as I said, David Silveira Garcia. And what I'd like you to do is, as I said, David is a fadista, and to give us a little bit, and I'll ask each and every one of you in your own way, because everything is specific to what you do and how you have these experiences with grandparents. Some of you, still have grandparents. Some of us, it's been a while since we've had grandparents. And so some of you, your grandparents may have just passed not too long ago. And so the experiences are all different, but I know that all of you have experiences with either your grandparents or, as in Esmeralda's case, when it gets to her turn, having that unique experience of having an extended family living together. So special to have your mom and dad, with your grandchildren, with your children, because that is, if my kids know how to speak Portuguese, I have to say it's because of my mom. Although I was a Portuguese teacher for 20 some years, and we spoke Portuguese at home, but then when they wanted to turn to English, when they were like 11 or 12, I turned to English with them. My mom and dad never did, and my in-laws never did. And they only spent about 3 hours a day with us other than sleep time, and they spent the other 7 or 8 with avo and avo. And so they are the reason that they know how to speak Portuguese as much as they still do. So in your, what I said when I was going to start with David, in your professional life, David, as a professional fado singer, your professional hobby, as you call it, tell us a little bit, first of all, about your relationship. I know you were close with your grandmother. I've seen plenty of posts on that, and I know it was a tough time for you when she passed. Tell us a little bit about that special relationship, and tell us a little bit how much of an influence your grandparents, or in this case, your grandmother or any other grandparent, was in your life, and a little bit on how you believe that they influenced who you are as a professional fadista singer.
Well, hello, Diniz. Thank you for inviting me. It's always an honor and a pleasure being here with you and everyone else. Yeah, me and my paternal grandmother, we were very close, and she unfortunately passed away at the age of 96 in March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And so me and her had a very close relationship throughout my entire life, based on the fact that Portuguese was always spoken 100%, and out of all her grandchildren, I was the one that had that communication level to an extent that we can have an adult conversation together. And I told this story on her services that one time she came over to our house and we started chatting, and 6 hours had gone by. My parents had already turned off the lights and gone to bed, and me and my grandmother were still sitting at the dinner table, talking our ears off, telling me her story of how she was born and what her childhood was like back in Pico, her immigration, because she came here in the early 70s at a very later age in life. She was already, gosh, I think in her 50s maybe, and that's pretty late. And she came over here, lived in San Joaquin Valley in Livingston. She worked for the Gallo vineyards, and then just became a homemaker. And so what I admired most about her was that resilience and that lack of fear, per se, of leaving her homeland to a country she had never been to at the age she was, and never really looked back, and started and established her life here. And her family grew tremendously. She had 8 children in total, and then 14 grandchildren. And I already lost count of the great-grandchildren. There was a couple of dozen. And so she was just an amazing worker, very caring and loving lady. And like the previous panel was talking about, food was a staple at Ava's house. And there was just something about her cooking and her stews and even her pancakes that no one can mimic. And so the times that we shared were always involved in the kitchen, making her sweetbread. And me and her were literally more than just grandmother and grandson. We were best friends.
And did she have any influence on you being so involved, not of course as a fadista, but also so very involved in Portuguese American organizations? How much of an influence do you think that special bond had upon you?
Oh, tremendous. My grandmother was a woman of few words, but the words that she said were very direct and blunt. There was no sugarcoating anything. And so I always appreciated her feedback. And that was one of the reasons why I joined the folklore group. And I would dress up. My costume happened to be from Pico. And just to see her expressions and her looking at my costume, oh, I used to wear sandals like that, or I knitted a sweater like that for your grandfather. And she actually knitted the socks I wear in the folklore group that I'm in now. And so that connection of her reliving her past through my involvement in the community is what makes it all that worth it. In regards to Fado, again, she's very blunt. She loved my first CD. The second CD, she was like, not so much, because I stepped a little outside the lines with Fado because I added some piano and some saxophone and an accordion. And she's like, I like it, mas não é fado, you know? She was very traditionalistic in her views as well. But as much as an exterior hard shell she had, she was a huge softie on the inside. And yeah, best friend.
So that's very, very special. We'll come back a little bit to that. We'll go to Amanda. Amanda is our youngest person here on the panel. And Amanda, I know, also has a special relationship with her grandmother. And so, Amanda, a little bit about your relationship and how has that played a role in who you are and who are you becoming as a young Portuguese American?
Yes, so growing up, my grandmother lived in the in-law apartment of our house. So I was with her from age 2 to 8. And every morning I would go over to her house and she would make breakfast for me. And sometimes when she would pray the rosary in front of her shrine in her bedroom, I would sit with her and listen to her pray the rosary. And my mother wanted my grandmother to teach me Portuguese, but my grandmother was very nervous that I wouldn't do well in school and she wanted me to assimilate to being an American. So even though she doesn't speak English, she would try to limit our communication in Portuguese too. So really her method of speaking with me or just showing that she loved me was like food and spending time with me and listening to music. And my grandmother came to the United States also when she was about 40 years old from San Miguel. And originally, when I was younger, she would try to tell me some stories about how she worked at a curtain factory in Boston with a bunch of other Portuguese ladies. And she loved being able to see the big airplanes fly in at Logan Airport. And she was very proud to be an American, but she also loved like cooking me caldo verde and like showing me that part of our culture. And now my grandmother is 86 and she has dementia and she lives with me now again. And so for the past year, I've been with her again. In high school, I had the option of taking French or Spanish. And because I really want to learn Portuguese and there was no Portuguese option, I took Spanish. And there's still different languages, but I'm able to communicate with my grandmother much better in Portuguese. And now when she tells me all her stories, when she can remember properly of living in San Miguel, I can understand them and we can have better conversations. So through this past year, we've also just been really close and we got to go to Portugal. We took her to mainland Portugal for the very first time this summer. And we went to Fatima, which was a really big deal because her name is Maria de Rosario de Fatima. And so we bond over Catholicism and food and music. And she also is like my best friend. Yeah.
That's very special. Write those stories down that she still remembers, please.
I will, I should.
Yeah, please do. We'll come back and visit that a little bit. And so Esmeralda, your connection, of course, with your grandparents, I believe your grandparents have passed, but your mom and dad lived with you, and so that special bond, as I said, between them and your children, and tell us a little bit about that special relationship. And of course, being a writer, I know that you have plenty of those memories written down, at least in notes here and there, that you'll be writing about.
I thank you, Diniz. You identified Amanda as the youngest panel member, and so I'm really grateful that
You're the second youngest. Yes, she's only a year younger than you are.
Yes. So I was thinking, I only knew my paternal grandparents, and when we came to Canada, they stayed in San Miguel, of course. And then when my grandfather died, my grandmother came to live with us. So I did have that experience as well, until I guess she died when I was 20. And then if we fast forward another 20 years or so, and I was living in Vancouver with my own family, young kids, and my parents lived in Edmonton, but they would visit often, and they'd come for a month at a time. And it was when I started noticing that something was not quite right with my mom, and she did get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So then it was a matter of having them move to Vancouver. And I was at home anyway, so why not me, right? To look after them. So they moved in with us, and yeah, I had young kids and older parents who needed care. My father had arthritis, but yeah, his brain was fine. And then my mom, of course, had, declining brain function, but her body was fine. So yeah, they lived here, and it was a difficult time, but in retrospect now, I mean, it was such a special time. And I think what came out of that, and of course, so many of my friends would come over and they'd say, oh, well, what about your privacy? And I'd go, what's that? We live in a small house, and for a while there were 6 people here. It was busy, and but for my children, I think what it did was just reinforce that connection. And I think in the end, they're not afraid of older people, and they're not afraid of sick people, and they're not afraid of people with dementia. And ultimately, my mother died in our house. We provided palliative care for her at home, and so the kids were giving her medicine, and it was just a very special time. Not easy, but just very helped shape us, all of us, my kids, but also me.
And so you feel it touched your kids significantly, I mean, as young people, because it was a total different experience for them than it was for you, obviously, only having contact with one grandparent and, for a while there. But them living with you, your mom and dad, and as that's in a multicultural household that yours is, that Portuguese presence, because your parents were immigrants, of course, and you too, at a very young age, did that kind of, although they were in frail health, but did that kind of help continue with the Portugueseness within the multicultural household? That's kind of my question.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I was hoping that my husband and my children would learn Portuguese when my parents were here, or improve their Portuguese. But in the end, I think my parents just ended up speaking bad English to them. But I think the language probably infiltrated a little bit, but the culture and sort of the just the responsibility of care and caring for each other, and which is, I think it's pretty unusual in our culture these days. And sure. I remember I can't remember exactly how old my son was, but let's say 9 or 10, and we were making the bed, and he was saying, "Oh, I guess I'm going to have to look after you when you're old and sick." And I said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Well, what about Georgia, your sister?" And he said, I don't think she has the patience for it, Mom. It's going to have to be me. So of course now,
Sure.
15 years later, maybe he's changed his mind. But I think and even now, they're just very concerned for older people in our lives who are not related to us, but they take the time to sit and that was really important to me. I think that's a part of our culture that will get passed on, whether or not they end up looking after me.
No, but those are wonderful values that your parents were that you were able to provide for them by having them live in your house. Wonderful. And we're going to come back and we'll talk a little bit about how, as a writer, you've internalized some of that, of course, in written. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to go to Kathy Mendes-Gulley. I know Kathy's having an issue with her camera, but Kathy, can you hear me?
I can, Diniz. Hello.
Oh, okay, good. So we won't see you. If I had a picture, I would put it up here, but maybe if you can, in a few minutes as well, tell us a little bit about your experience with your grandparents. And I should say, because Kathy published the book. So Kathy took what we were talking about, like Professor Elena de Menezes did, about her great-grandparents. Kathy did the same thing, and she published a book about the family history and has since then been actually working with genealogy and discovering lots of different things for lots of different families. But Kathy, how important was the presence of your grandparents and even great-grandparents, if you remember those, in your life?
Well, I was especially close to my father's parents, my Azorean immigrant grandparents. We lived on the dairy with them. We called it the ranch. And in those days when I was growing up, we children were free to wander wherever we chose to go all day. And most of the time we were at Grandma's house. We would pick figs. I remember eating a lot of figs, and also raid her cookie jar. And my grandparents impressed upon me some very important concepts about my faith and about family, because my grandma always had her rosary with her. And every time we were doing, they would always ask about things like what was going on in catechism and things like that, and making sure that we were attending church. But they also taught me, especially my grandpa, about having a strong work ethic. He came here at 16 years old and started working and worked his entire life. And I saw how dedicated he was to what he was doing. That really impressed upon me how important it was to have a work ethic and a job that brought joy and livelihood as well. But I envy some of the panelists that are talking about how close their conversation, their relationships were with their grandparents, because I was one of so many grandkids that I never really felt like a very, very special connection to them, because I was sharing them with all of my siblings and cousins. So what I'm concentrating on is in being a grandmother. And I know from family research now that there were so many things about my grandparents that I didn't know because I didn't ask. And so I'm just concentrating on sharing what I know and my experiences and my family history with my own grandchildren. And I loved Esmeralda's story and Amanda's stories about having grandparents live in the house with us. And I love the idea of multi-generational living. And I tell my son about that all the time. And so far, haven't had any good response.
You haven't been invited, huh?
No, not
for a permanent stay.
But I think it's a beautiful idea. I remember my grandmother saying to me one time, your parents are responsible to teach you where you're going, and I'm responsible to teach you where you come from. And so that's what I'm concentrating on now as a grandparent. And I am taking my 3 grandchildren to the Azores in June, and we're very excited about that trip. But I will add also that listening to the panel this morning in Portuguese, and unfortunately, I am not very good at speaking or understanding the Portuguese language. I have taken a class and I did get an A, but I need everybody to slow down when they're speaking Portuguese to me. So listening to that this morning kind of transported me back to when I was a little girl and we would be at family gatherings. When the conversation turned to Portuguese, it was usually because it was a conversation we children were not supposed to be hearing. And it was funny this morning listening to that conversation in Portuguese, it transported me back to that time when it made me very curious to know what they were talking about. And it reminded me that there are things that I didn't know about my grandparents, and there are things that were kept secret. And in my research, I've uncovered lots of things, lots of missing pieces that I've been able to use to put together and have a better understanding of my grandmother and my grandfather and their relationship with their children and with our church and all of those things. And finding those missing pieces has been important for me because it makes things a lot clearer and helps me to understand who they are and who I am. So my connection to my grandparents now, even though they are both long deceased, is a lot. I just treasure it so much more now because I've come to understand them as people in my adult state instead of just in my childhood observations. And I see that they made mistakes and they had achievements, and like me, they carried on, and I'm just proud to know their stories now, and I want to make sure to tell my grandchildren my story, and make sure they know who their ancestors are. And I'm taking that very seriously.
Yes, you are. Indeed. And you wrote a book about it, actually. And so thank you, Kathi. We'll come back and visit that. Thank you, Anthony. That was you're a genius anyway. So and we will, with that, we'll turn to Anthony and a little bit about your relationship with your grandparents as well, Anthony, which both grandparents, I know that you've known both of them from both sides of your paternal side and your maternal side, and a couple of them figure into the book, into the land of milk and money, one way or another, directly or indirectly, they're there.
I grew up in a little Azorean bubble because of my grandparents. I grew up on my grandfather's dairy farm in Central California. Ava and Avu lived next door. Their house was like an extension of our house. You walked over and the door was always open, and you could go in and call for a Vava or ask where Vuvu was. And it was just the way things were. I didn't realize until years later, when I had friends at school to compare notes with, that it wasn't like everybody lived next door to their grandparents. And people spoke lots of different languages. I grew up speaking exclusively Portuguese until just before I started kindergarten. Kindergarten was a bit of a challenge. Only my cousin Frankie sitting next to me and I could speak to each other naturally because everyone else was babbling away in English. And our exposure to English was just on the TVs we had recently acquired because we were learning it from cartoons. It wasn't a conversational language. And thanks to that experience, growing up in an Azorean environment in Central California, that I retain any Portuguese at all. English has completely taken over my life, and I'm a lecturer in college, and I speak English just all the time. But thanks to that early heritage and the fact that I remained in communications with my paternal grandmother until after I turned 30, and then we lost her. But until that time, I would call my grandmother every week and chat with her. And one of my regrets was that she never corrected my Portuguese. Anything I said was good as far as she was concerned. And Diniz, you know that has inhibited my Portuguese speaking, because in English, I'm an educated man. In Portuguese, I speak like a small child who was never corrected by his grandparents because they didn't want to discourage us from speaking in Portuguese. So I'm grateful, and I also have regrets about that. But the stories about my grandparents, yeah, they've informed and shaped my life. And writing my novel was in a significant way a tribute to them, especially to my grandmother, who was the central pillar of our family all of her life. She could enforce neutral ground where there were no disputes, or she would give you a bad time. And it was once she was gone that we found out how many schisms there were in the family. They weren't papered over anymore. So we all miss her, but she's still with us in so many ways. And when I was at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, when they were inaugurating their new Portuguese Cultural Center, and I got to be a speaker at the inaugural event, it was great because I was talking about my grandparents. It was like everyone in the room was totally attuned to what I was saying. And when I showed the picture of my grandparents, my grandmother, Theolinda, and my grandfather, Francisco, I said, that's my grandmother. She was a pillar of strength. She was a very traditional, old world woman who deferred to her husband and was ever so careful never to make it appear that she was manipulating him or give him reason to suspect that she was.
And indeed, but she was, and a very smart woman she was, and really, as you said, in many ways, a towering person in the character in the book Land of Milk and Money, which I highly recommend. And Anthony, the story, and that's actually a good point, Professor Manuela Marujo, or I'll just call Manuela. Everybody just instead of using the titles now. And Ida has also had this experience. It is interesting, you know, when one teaches Portuguese, the students will arrive in a classroom setting and they know Portuguese, but they know these simple things that they do wrong, and they kind of know it's wrong, but it's just the way they do it. And I don't know, maybe the second or third year that I was teaching, I went to my mom's house, who just passed away, as all of you know, and I went to my mom's house probably to pick up my kids. I don't know exactly what it was for, but it had to be something like that. And we just had something in chat that I'd like to share with you. Carmen Carvalho from Toronto put a nice little comment saying she enjoyed it very much, but she has to leave because she has to go pick up her granddaughter, 10-year-old granddaughter. That's what grandmothers do in the Portuguese community, but and not only in the Portuguese community. However, I was saying I went to my mom's house, and my nephew, who is now in his early 30s, was there, and she was talking to him, and she said to him in Portuguese, Andrew, you didn't eat. You know, that was my mother's thing, you know, you need to eat, 24/7. You didn't eat, and he said to my grandmother, to my mom in Portuguese, avó, me comeu na escola. And I said to my mom, what are you letting him getting away with that? You would never let Mike to. Oh, he's not like you too, because they spoke Portuguese at home. He doesn't speak Portuguese at home. I am not going to correct him because I do not want him to get upset at me. So I am never going to correct him. I understand perfectly what he's trying to say. Instead of saying eu já comi na escola, me comi na escola, I understand. I know exactly. And so, but to this day, of course, my Andrew, my nephew still says that some of the Portuguese he doesn't know is because Val never corrected him. But how does one do that? It's tough. We're going to go back around the same kind of and David, your experience in the community, your experience with your Val, and the community is changing, and I'd like us to. This is about, of course, the role of grandparents. But the community, whether it be in Canada or the United States, is different. Manuela knows this very, very well. It's not the same community that it was 25 or 30 years ago, and it will not be the same community 15 and 20 years from now. But grandparents still are an important part in all societies. David, how do you see this? How do you see this, David, as far as the community going forward without these pillars? Such as your avó, which was avó Garcia, right? Which was your paternal, such as avó Garcia, and this pillar of this person that could talk to you about stories and stories about her experience in immigrants. Do you see some of the younger people that you know, and some of the younger people that you know now have kids, and so how do you see the community moving forward? Will it be it will be a different community, we know, but these pillars are gone, and the younger generation, even younger grandparents, are a little bit different, don't have probably some of the knowledge that you have or your parents do because they're immigrants. Your assessment of that, your assessment of how this is going to move forward, including in the Portuguese language, the lack of grandparents speaking Portuguese at home, in your perspective, does that affect the continuation of the language?
That's a loaded question. I think it varies based on how you were brought up from family to family. Speaking in my own, everyone was really tied to a avó, and she was very active in her community, loved helping the church and the hall. And I think with the upcoming generation, so my generation, you still have a couple of people active in it, and they're playing that role because avó did it. I think the next generation, it may dwindle. And I think it's not going to be until maybe 2 or 3 generations afterwards that they're going to appreciate their roots. So like if you look at Hawaii, for example, these are 8, 9 generations later, and they're still fighting for their culture there, more so than probably people who are only in their 2nd or 3rd generation, because they were raised with it, they're familiar with it, but they're not as passionate anymore towards it. Because they didn't have that connection with avó that some of us have now. It'll affect. I don't know how to answer that question.
No, no, you answer perfectly. You answer perfectly. Yeah, it's going to have some effect. It always does, and it has an effect throughout the community. There's a Portuguese radio man here in California that says, cada vez que morre uma avó, eu perco uma família. Every time that a grandmother dies, he loses the whole family listening to him. He says the only person listening to that radio is grandma. And the kids may listen to it because grandma's listening to it. So out of respect, the grandkids are listening to it. The parents, of course, still understand, but they may not be in the house, they may be working. And so he says every time, that's his famous line, quando morre uma avó, eu perco uma família, as listeners. And so that has indeed some effects on the language. Do you think, though, I know that you're very involved in the community in San Jose and the community of the whole state of California, but especially the Bay Area. Culturally, do you think people are tied to these? We were talking about, Amanda spoke about food and cultural traditions, favorite foods. You also spoke about, with your grandmother with the massa cevada and other kind of different kinds of foods. Do you think that some of these traditions around culture, whether be food or cultural traditions, will continue even though Avol's not there?
I do think they will continue, and they are continuing, but there's going to be some modification. People are going to start adding their own twists. Things are going to change a little bit, and I know the older generation is, with no disrespect to anyone, the older generation is really tied to, that this is how we did it, and this is how we always have to do it. Where the youth is, yeah, we can respect it and we appreciate it, but let's do it this way to make it a little bit better, but still hold on to that cultural, traditional aspect. In my grandmother's case, I would try to make her version of sweetbread, and she'd look at me, está faltando ovo, está faltando manteiga, something's missing. And it's still edible. It's not like she did it, but it's still edible. But in her mind, this is not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be done this way. And I think with the older generation, it is challenging sometimes in adapting the younger generation into it, because the younger generation has new ideas, new ways of doing things, still meeting the same end goal, just a different way of doing it. And sometimes there is some clashing on that to get the older generation to agree to the new ideas.
Indeed, I'm thinking, for example, of a famous fadista I know who introduced different instruments, and his grandmother didn't like the fado as much.
Exactly.
You may know him as well. Amanda, in your thought as well, as you said, you've had such a close relationship and still do. Your vo's still alive. How do you think your life would be different if your vo wasn't with you? I mean, she's kind of a staple in the family. She's there.
So my grandmother definitely instilled in my mother and all of her siblings the importance of continuing on our culture. So all of my cousins and I have been involved in the Portuguese community, and they've all been trying to go to the Azores and learn about it. So I think when she passes away, in honor of her, like David was saying, we're still going to continue to do all the things that she did. And also with other kids my age in the next gen leadership with Caucus, a lot of people are in my same boat. Either they're really, really close with their grandparents who are still alive, or they've passed away, but because of their love for their grandparent, they want to stay connected to the Portuguese community and are concerned about ways to ensure that people who are maybe already in their third and fourth generation who don't know how to get involved, how we can help get them involved and teach them about the culture that maybe they didn't live in a little Portuguese bubble. And so ways that we can help teach them to cherish the beautiful heritage and culture that they do have.
That's the best way that you can honor your vo. Thank you for doing that, you and everyone else. Esmeralda, so as a writer, how do you take all of these concepts and all of these thoughts and all of these emotions as well and put it on paper? And I know your memoir, of course, is full of lots of this. I'm sure it has different tonalities to it. Is writing also a way for you to express these cultural traditions and some things that get lost as grandparents pass on.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think I did a little bit of writing when my parents were still alive, and I would check with them, is it okay if I write this? And but now that they're, you know, everyone has died, I think it's a huge honor to write about people who have died. But you know, I think as a writer, I also have the responsibility of being realistic. So for me, it's always weighing that, you know, the realism and honoring the dignity of people who have passed on. So yeah, it's hard. I remember a friend of mine, you know, when I was talking about my mother, she'd say, "Oh, you look at that relationship with rose-colored glasses." And I said, no, we had a really lovely relationship. But I think, you know, as time goes on, you do remember the good things more, and those are the things I want to write about more. But I think you have a responsibility to readers as well to say, well, it wasn't always like that. There were difficulties. And so, yeah, it's always a balancing act, and it's a big deal for me to write about people who have died. You know, when I write about...
Yeah, do writers have a responsibility? I mean, Portuguese American writers, and let's look at that aspect, because I know you write generally about things, you know, but there is even the title of your memoir. It's very, you know, the Portuguese part of you and your experience. You're in a community that's not very large, obviously, in Vancouver. It's not like the same thing as in Toronto, where there's Portuguese in a very concentrated area, although that's changing. But do you think that as a writer, there's this kind of responsibility to pass on some of these things that David and Amanda just talked about? Because stories, oral history is, as I've been discovering, is of utmost importance. But if we do not register it in a writing format, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, it sometimes doesn't get passed on because people forget and life gets busy. So as a Portuguese American who can write, and you write very well, everything I've read from you, I'm very serious, is very, very well. So as a Portuguese, in this case, as a Portuguese Canadian, I always want to say that, Portuguese American, as a Portuguese person in North America, how important do you think is this to take, as we call it in Portuguese, this dom, and use it to pass on what an older generation lived, and to pass on these cultural traditions in stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think stories are so important. And for me, I think, you know, for grandparents and parents that have passed on, for me, what's important is that, you know, we speak their names, we tell their stories. And yeah, and I guess not everybody has to write about them, but I think it's important to keep those stories going and to pass them on. And yeah, for me, it takes the writing form, but I think, you know, the oral storytelling is also really important. And I think, you know, now I tell my sister's grandchildren, I make sure I talk about, you know, their ancestors too, right? So they don't read the things I write, but I think it's important to tell the stories. Well, yeah, I hope so. And I think you know, everybody remembers things differently. And that's why I think it's important to get some of your thoughts and your impressions down. Like when I write something about our family, invariably my sister calls me up and says, "That's not how I remember it." And I go, "Yeah, okay, well, you write it then too," right? Because we both remember things differently. And so I think it is important to pass on, yeah, our stories, our impressions, because that's what we have, right? From the past. It's memories and it's stories.
Indeed, so. Indeed. And to honor them, as Amanda said, thank you so much. And Kathi, so, and your book was basically a tribute to your grandparents, and I believe it was launched when you were celebrating a special date. So what drove you, of course, to write this book of family history was basically an honor to them, correct?
That's right. It was for them. you know, they were two very poor, living in very poor villages in the Azores, and had the opportunity to come to the United States. Both came before 1920, and they met here, and with very little to go on, they made a life, and they created, you know, they ended up having great success. They had a big family and were able to provide for their family. And so I ended up with boxes full of stuff that nobody in my family wanted. And as I went through it, these were all such treasures. I couldn't imagine that I would leave them in boxes in a closet for someone to eventually toss out. Going through those letters, photos, pictures, documents that I found, that probably everyone has a box like that somewhere with important things that belong to their parent. You know, I thought this could very easily be put together to tell the story. And I imagined, you know, 10 or 12 pages of these documents and photos. And it ended up being about 300 pages, because as I would go along and talk with cousins, talk with other Portuguese people in the community that knew them, it just grew and grew and grew. And it was important to tell about their life together. And I did publish it on their, what would have been their 100th wedding anniversary. And this box of things that nobody wanted now all of a sudden became a real commodity, you know, because the photos I found were amazing. Especially the photos and things from the 40s during the war years. My grandparents did so much for young men that were serving in the military, and that was important to me. In my home now, I have all of these tokens. There are so many tokens representing the life of my grandparents, and they're all over my home. And when my grandkids are here, it gives me an opportunity to tell them. I have a clarinet, although it's not the clarinet my grandfather owned. He learned to play the clarinet in an orphanage in Angra. And by having that clarinet here, I can tell them about my grandpa. I can show them a picture of him in the orphanage with his clarinet. So now all three of my grandchildren are interested in music. Nobody's playing the clarinet yet, but they're taking violin lessons and piano lessons. And I just feel like that's a direct result of me talking to them about music. And it is an important responsibility. I take it very seriously. My grandkids are very lucky. They have 3 living grandmothers, and we are a team working, you know, to make sure they know where they came from and stories about our family. And someday, I hope, when my grandparents are 200 and 300 years gone, the book that I created and the stories that I tell and the curiosity that I create in these children will live on, and they'll be telling their grandchildren. That's all I can hope for.
That's all any of us can hope for, indeed. Anthony, and so the same thing as far as we spoke about how, you know, it was part of who you were, and this wonderful bit of information that I didn't know, that you spoke to your grandmothers about every single week until you were 30. That's amazing. And of course, we're not going to blame her because your Portuguese is quite well. But how does creativity, so arts, in your case, writing, how important is to use art, whether it be in writing such as you and Esmeralda do, fiction, nonfiction, or David with music? How important is through the arts to pass on this legacy that we got from our grandparents, and how do you see that moving forward? Because sometimes when I attend an event, a cultural event, and whether it be the musician or the author talks about his grandmother or his grandfather, how it influenced him or in one way or another. I believe, that he or she could have done that same concert, or could have done that same book reading, or could have done that same poetry reading without mentioning that. But to that, it's kind of a tribute to that memory that will live forever and ever through the arts. So tell us a little bit how, of course, you through literature, but how important you follow all different kinds of arts, how important is to pass on the legacy, one's own cultural legacy, which came from your grandparents, in this case, through the various art forms.
In many respects, I'm a kind of outlier in my family in being a writer. But the cultural aspects of the Azores were constantly in the background. We'd go to festas, we'd go to events, and it would always be the Portuguese-speaking community in our neighborhood. There are a lot of Portuguese people in Tulare County, and that's one of the reasons why there was a Portuguese language mass at our local parish. So Portuguese songs, Portuguese practices were always with us. And there was always the parada, the parade at the festa, and things of that sort. When it comes to writing and literature, I have to say that when it comes to arts and crafts, my family came down more on the crafts side of things. My great-great-grandfather was legendary within family stories for being a faz-tudo. He could do anything. He was a skilled craftsman. You needed to fix something. My great-great-grandfather was Francisque, and they called him Mestre Francisque, Master Frank, or Teacher Frank, or Professor Frank, because he was a master and he could do all kinds of wonderful things. And that came down on the Barcellos side through my grandfather and my father, and a little bit to me, because my father helped build the home that we lived in. And when I was still a small child, he built a big bookcase for books. We had lots of books. And when I was older, I built another wall unit full of shelves and cabinets. And so I was able to do some cabinet work too. And my grandfather always was willing to help me buy books for my own collection, for my library of math and science and fiction. So much of my library is built around a kernel of what my avu purchased for me. And to give credit to my father, for whom I am named, my father was an intense autodidact. He couldn't go to school because of the demands of the dairy farm. I mean, he was asked if he wanted to go to high school, and he thought it was clear they wanted him to say no so he could spend more time on the dairy farm, and that was the decision he made. But later in life, he got his GED, he went to night classes, he learned electronics, he became successful in retail electronics, a career as a successful dairyman, followed by a successful career in TVs and stereos and equipment repair and satellite dish antennas for people who wanted to pick up the Brazilian Portuguese TV satellites, so they could have Portuguese language in the Central Valley before it was otherwise generally available. And that aspect of first the craft of being able to build things, and then the dedication, the respect for the written word in terms of books. When I became a writer, no one reacted like, oh, that's completely contrary to what we've always done. Many things I did was completely contrary to what we'd always done, because I went away to school and I got advanced degrees and I became a math instructor and I started publishing things. But it was consistent with the support I got earlier in life that books are good. writing is good. No, we don't do it, but you know, if Tony wants to start doing it, that is fine. And in terms of arts, I mentioned after Kathi mentioned that her grandfather learned the clarinet at the orphanage. My grandfather went to that orphanage for an education, and he learned the clarinet there. My father learned guitar. We had a piano. We had an organ. I have a piano somewhere under a stack of books. I'm sure I could find it if I needed to. So art and culture and writing and books were part of the family milieu. And I've gone farther with that than others, but I always felt that I had a foundation in what I wanted to do. And my father had every reason to be jealous of my educational opportunities, which were denied him. But he made sure that what he wanted, I could do. And as a result, I went to various colleges and universities, and I get to be a college math instructor now. That's due to Dad, and that's due to the support his parents gave him in turn. So it does go back to my grandparents and even my great-great-grandfather, Mestre Francisco, who could do anything.
Faz tudo. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And that's a wonderful way to end it. We could continue this for a while. There's one aspect that all of you touched upon one way or another, and that was, I think it's a fascinating topic for us to have maybe a panel during our PBBI lecture and conference series for the spring of 2022, which is religion, because all of you in one way or another talked how much Catholicism, and this is because, as all of you know, or I think most of you know, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute with our oral history just produced a video not too long ago, and we're working on another one. We need to actually interview some of you here from California, Anthony and David, and that is on the Portuguese American experience. And there was this wonderful person that said, I could not imagine myself without being Portuguese, and to me being Portuguese is also being Catholic. Now that of course has changed throughout time, but I think it's a fascinating topic for us to maybe dwell on. We can do it in a minute or so, but how important the church, and in this case Catholicism, and whatever brand it is, because it's everybody has a different nuanced look to it, but how important that was in the relationship that you had and still have, even though they've passed, with your grandparents. But we will take that on as a different time. So I just want to thank all of you so much for participating. I wish we also had time for Kathi Mendes-Gulley to tell that wonderful story that she told me. I don't know if it can be done in public, maybe one day as well, about her grandfather and how the family went to church and he didn't, and then the reason why. It's a fascinating and lovely story, and that touches upon the religious aspect that we're talking about. But I want to thank each and every one of you. I hope that as we move forward, we have still 2 more days, and as Professor Manuela Marujo and Professor Aida Batista, who've been all along with me, and Professor Rosa Simas, who is also on the line, I believe, still. And we would love to, of course, as we set up Bruma Publications at Fresno State, to have a published work based on the presentations that were done by the different academics throughout the last 2 days and the next 2 days, but also these testimonials. So I'm going to challenge each and every one of you to think about this and to start writing a little bit about it in whatever language you feel best at it. And we'd like to include these written testimonies that we've had here. I don't want to include it just as a simple transcript of what we've done here, but within these thoughts, we'd love to include a piece from each and every one of you. So be thinking about that. Again, we thank you all so very much. And I'm going to turn just really quickly to Portuguese. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas. Eu esqueço-me sempre dessa parte, não é? Nunca sou politicamente correto. Mas obrigado a todos em geral e todas pela vossa participação. Temos mais 2 dias, portanto, quarta e quinta-feira, e portanto, há pouco, antes de começarmos este painel, a professora Manuela Marujo disse que nós iríamos começar com 10 minutos, quase 10 minutos de atraso, mas não era muito. Não, à hora portuguesa, nós acabamos com 10 minutos ainda. Portanto, porque pelo menos nas comunidades portuguesas do Canadá e dos Estados Unidos, tudo começa com 20 minutos de atraso. Aliás, eu tinha um aluno, permitam-me só esta, eu tive um aluno que chegava consistentemente às aulas sempre atrasado, sempre, 7 minutos, 8 minutos, 10 minutos, e ele dizia, mas professor, eu não percebo, o senhor não é português, porque o senhor começa a aula há horas, e portanto nós na comunidade portuguesa começamos tudo atrasado, o senhor não é português, e eu tinha que lhe explicar que, portanto, obviamente que este era outro conceito de ser português, e as aulas, se estão marcadas para as 10 horas, têm que começar às 10, não é? Portanto, Manuela, ainda acabamos com 1 minuto, portanto, excedente. Muito obrigado a todos mais uma vez, e eu deixo a última palavra para a moderadora de hoje, a professora Manuela Marujo. E até amanhã às 9 horas.
Uma boa noite a todos, boa tarde, para nós é boa noite, ainda vou dar uma aula Zoom aos meus alunos, aos meus netos em português, e agradeço, foi ótimo as vossas apresentações. Thank you so much for those who speak English and speak so dearly about their grandparents. I feel I have hope. One day my grandchildren will talk about me in English. I don't mind. Their Portuguese is very basic, but it's wonderful that you keep those memories and write about them. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado. Boa noite a todos. Deus.